My name is Joey Asher. I am president of SpeechWorks. I am here with my colleague, JD Clockadale. JD, wave to everybody. Can we see JD? I don't know. Where is JD? Oh, there he is. There's JD. All right. Welcome, everyone. This is our final webinar of the year, and we thought we would end the year by focusing on the fundamentals of great communication skills. And so what we're going to do on this call is we're going to count down, JD and I are going to count down the 5 things that you need to do if you want to be successful as a communicator, especially in presentations. You know, there are a million tips out there. There are tons of books that you can read. I think there's a book out there called 1,001 Tips on How to Be a Better Communicator. Well, we really feel like, while there are a lot of tips and you can get a lot of input, there are really just a handful of things that we think you need to do well. So we're going to focus on those 5 things. We're going to count them down, the top 5. But we're also going to answer your questions. And and already you have put in a bunch of issues that we're going to sort of address as we go forward. Once again, I would encourage you as we go forward to go to the chat box, ask us questions, argue with us. We may well urge you to get off of mute and give us your point of view on things. But again, feel free to jump in. JD, did you want to say something?
No, welcome everybody. Welcome to the last one. Glad to have everybody.
JD, yeah, you're coming through not too well. You're not coming through particularly well, JD. I think you've frozen up. You've frozen up. Okay, well, we're going to keep going. So we're going to count down. Starting now, we're going to count down the top 5 things that we think you need to do if you want to be successful as a communicator. And we start with number 5. Number 5, the most important thing you need to do if you want to be an effective communicator is you need to keep it simple. One of the things that we tell people all the time is to ask yourself before you're going into your presentation, before you're going into your meeting, is to ask yourself, what are my 3 key messages? What are the simple things that you really want your listeners to remember? I've been working with my daughter this week because she is applying to jobs. And she had to do a presentation. They asked her to record a presentation for a particular job she was looking for. And, you know, it was very technical sounding. It was for some sort of website that she was applying to work for. And I said, well, what are the core messages? What are the 3 things? And it took her no time at all to focus on those 3 things. This is the idea, is to ask yourself, what must your listeners really remember? So that's number 1. We want to focus on those simple things. Ask yourself, what are the simple things you really want your listeners to remember? Now, I want to go to Heather. Heather, I think this is relevant to what we're talking about here. Heather, can you unmute? Can you unmute for a moment? You wrote here, one of the challenges, embracing the idea that less is more. Could you talk about why you said that's a challenge? Why is that a challenge? Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure. I'm a detail person, and I think all details are important, while I know that they aren't all important for other people, for everybody else. So really kind of filtering through my brain the essential points. And I've listened to you a few times, and I'm really making progress brainwashing myself, but it's a difficult thing to let go of.
What do you do? What is your business?
I'm actually an integrative health coach and a body worker, but I'm trying to break into social entrepreneurship.
I see. Well, it sounds great. Yeah, I think a lot of us who are detailed people, or who really sort of know our stuff really, really well, we want to sort of tell everything that we know. But really, in a presentation context, it's really about just identifying those simple things that are really, really most important for our listeners to remember, because the fact of the matter is they're not going to remember most of what we're going to say in any of our presentations. So we need to really be focused on just a few things. So let's go to the next thing that we wanted to focus on. JD, what's the next thing that we want to focus on in terms of being effective as communicators?
I think JD is getting
The
back
other
on.
one's just speaking with a little bit of intensity.
Go ahead. Say it again, JD.
Yeah, so one of the things is speaking with some intensity and some eye contact. How many people have seen this in a presentation when they're doing this? Raise your hand. Anybody ever seen that before? Brian's children. So yeah, so people don't make eye contact. So you got to make eye contact, and primarily making sure you look straight at the camera like this. A lot of people don't do that because we have the instinct to look at the pictures. It doesn't work that way in the virtual world. The other thing is speaking with some intensity. You got to have a little intensity when you start. I mean, I always imagine that if we started a Friday presentation and Joey said, "Hey guys, welcome everybody. We're excited to have you here." Your intensity sets the tone for the presentation. And I don't know, I've done kind of an official study in workshops. About 85 to 95% of business presentations are just unboring. We have all been in them, and I'm pretty sure we have all given them. So you got to speak with some intensity to get the audience engaged in what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sean has asked a question related to the first point we just made. Sean, why don't you unmute and ask your question?
Sure. If you're getting 3 points across and you want people to remember them, what's the best way to ensure that they understand that they've got those points? That way, when you move ahead, you have that collective understanding between everybody.
Yeah, so it's a really important point. How do we actually make sure that the points actually stick? Sean, let me just ask you a question. Where do you work? You work at the Home Depot?
Yes, I work at the Home Depot.
Okay, the reason I asked that is because I think that actually thinking about the Home Depot advertising is kind of a way to think about this to some extent. The idea here is you got to decide what your 3 points are. You got to decide what the language is that you're going to use, and you need to stick with it. So the reason I pointed out you were at the Home Depot. What's the current slogan that you hear the advertising slogan for the Home Depot these days?
I think that'd be a great question for everybody else to see if it does stick. But helping doers get more done.
Helping doers get more done. And before that, I think it was you can do it, we can help. And we say what you do is you say the same phrase the exact same way every single time. You don't say. Sometimes you don't say you can do it, we can help. And then you say, you're able to accomplish it and we're able to be of assistance. You don't change it every time. You say it one way every single time. And I think that's one real good way to make sure that your core points stick. Come up with a nice tight message and then make sure that you use the phrasing the same way every time. I think a lot of people are hesitant to do that because they feel like they're being redundant or something like that. But I really don't think they are. I don't think it comes across that way. I think it just comes across that you're just trying to drive your message home.
Hey, Joey, Gina looked like she had on. So what is intensity? That popped up on the chat while you were talking. Great question. Gina, is intensity is voice energy. When you're speaking, I always relate it to when I have to read to my children. At Mystery Reader, yes, my kids are actually in school and it's amazing, but I still have to read to them. And I've got an 8-year-old, and let me tell you, there's nothing worse than being the parent that bores the children. So you got to use your voice. You got to get some intensity in the words. You can speak louder or softer. You can speak faster or slower. You can also have hand gestures. A lot of us are positioned, for example, I'm standing up because I recently had back surgery, so it's a little weird, but a lot of people present kind of like this. It's very weird. So we can't see your body language. All we see is a floating head. So intensity can be not just your virtual presence when you're looking in the camera like this, but also your hand gestures as you're speaking, because your hand gestures add some emphasis. They add energy. It's all of those little things that can add up on these presentations. But I will tell you, though, from an intensity perspective, the biggest thing you can do is sit like this in the camera so that people can actually see your body. It's probably the number one thing you can change without any practice by putting yourself in the camera properly. So thank you very much for asking that. Joey, I don't know if there's any more questions, but I'll kind of lead us to that third piece.
Yeah, well, actually, Steve Archon asked a question about how to be a better storyteller. Steve, could you go ahead and unmute and tell us a little bit about your question?
Well, it's kind of like a gift that the comedians have when they get up there and they do a set and they tell a story and it just captivates the audience. And in sales, if you can tell a good story, it's memorable. That's what they're going to remember. So I always focus on the three things, but trying to weave and tell a story and orchestrate a story, it goes back to preparation. And I think we can all prepare and organize a story, but delivering it sometimes a little bit different in a presentation environment.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a really good point. Steve makes the point about how do you tell a good story? And actually, that's the third point that we wanted to make in terms of what makes for a good presentation, is to make sure that you are telling stories. So thank you, Steve, for teeing us up well here. So the question, of course, is what makes a good story? I think it's a couple of things. First of all, a story has to have a person that's at the center of the story. That's usually a really important idea here, is that you have to have a person at the center of the story. Actually, my good friend Josh Peck just did a really great sort of interview, video about what makes a good story. Josh, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about, I don't know, I'm kind of putting my friend on the spot here.
It's not a problem.
But Josh is in the public relations field, and tell us what makes for a good story.
Well, I work with lawyers, and some of them, it comes naturally to some of them because they do this in court. But a story has a protagonist and an antagonist. If you remember your high school English, there's usually a good guy and a bad guy, not necessarily. And you're describing some conflict that is resolved. And the conflict may be a business problem sitting in front of your clients. But from my point of view, it's always better, and I'm agreeing 100% with Joey here, it's always better to zero in on a particular instance that illustrates the point, because that's what people can accept, identify with, and perhaps most important, remember. So, and you see good political speakers do this all the time. They don't talk about the problems of homelessness and hunger. They talk about Diana, the homeless and hungry little girl, and you hear what her life is like. So yeah, I think this works in all contexts. I'll stop.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Josh. The story that I tell quite a bit to illustrate the point of the importance of making 3 points. I just told you about my daughter. For years, I used to tell another story about my daughter, Annie, when she was running for secretary of the 5th grade class at Dunwoody Springs Elementary School. She came to my bedroom. She wanted help with her speech. And so she started reading me her speech, and it was awful. So once again, think about what Josh just said. We have a protagonist. It's my daughter. What's the problem? She's giving a terrible speech. And then along comes, dad to be hopefully the hero to say, okay, Annie, tell me what are the 3 key messages that they must remember why they should vote for you for treasurer of the 5th grade class. And she said very quickly, you should vote for me because I'm going to work hard, I'm going to listen, and I am going to make sure we keep the bathrooms clean. And the point of the story is that it's easy to come up with 3 points, but we've told the story, we've illustrated it through specific ideas with a person like my daughter as sort of the protagonist, if you will. The other thing that really helps is just having some detail, not just sort of telling a generic story, but being somewhat detailed about it. So these are all different things. And the final thing I think is really important is just to make sure you practice your stories. I've got about myself and JD and anybody who who speaks a lot usually has about 5 or 6 stories that we tell sort of over and over again. So just get a couple of good stories and just reuse them is always a good thing. Let's look at some of the other. You guys have a lot of questions here, a lot of issues that you've raised. Let's talk about some of these here. Brian, why don't you Brian Heatwall says challenge reading an audience from a Zoom meeting. Brian, why don't you elaborate on that?
Well, I think the challenge is that a lot of times we work in the government space. And a lot of times we don't get a chance to do a lot of discovery. Typically, you have to make assumptions based on the client profile and who you're presenting to. And typically, when I go into a presentation, you've got your hook, you're starting your presentation, you're starting to align yourself with someone in the room, right? one of the ways I overcome fear in speaking of big groups is you find someone that is making eye contact with you, and then you can speak to them, right? You always float around, but you always have 2 or 3 alphas in the room that you always can align yourself in just to gather yourself. And so, you know, we live in a different world, and we may continue to be doing Zoom meetings, and you're not able to read the room, right?
Yeah,
like
it's
you
a
do
problem.
face-to-face.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem in this Zoom video world in particular. How do you read the room? It's definitely harder. I think the key is to do a lot of things that we're trying to do on this call, on calls like this, which is structure your messages much more loosely. I think that's one thing you can do, so that you leave lots of time for the interaction. You can sort of force the interaction. And it's kind of the way that we're doing now. You know, I sort of forced the interaction by calling on you, Brian, and asking you to sort of tell me your point of view. So that's sort of one thing you can do. The other thing you can do, even though we tell everybody to make eye contact with the camera lens, like what I'm doing now, and JD said before, you want to make eye contact with the camera lens. We're not saying you can never look away. You want to be sort of scanning the all the images to sort of see whether it looks like people are paying attention. And then, just utilizing the tools like the Zoom, the chat, doing everything you can to make it as interactive as possible. I think those are good ones. Let's go to the next one, which is JD. What's the next success factor? The second, this will be our 4th success factor, or actually the 2nd success factor. We're counting down to number 1.
Yep, counting down to number 1. Number 2 on the top 5 countdown is practice Q&A. I always ask groups, I say, do you practice Q&A? Most people don't. And they usually just read their slides. And the second question I ask, is it pretty much 100% chance that they're going to ask questions? And they say yes. I said, then why don't you practice Q&A? I don't quite get this concept. The best person I've ever heard say it is Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State of the U.S., who, by the way, is still alive, would sometimes say to the press, does anybody have any questions for the answers I've prepared? I think that is very, very telling. If you are really ready for a presentation, you will have practiced Q&A. Let me ask this, though. I don't know, Asia, I see you again. You're just my regular visitor. Why is Q&A so important?
I would say it's super important because it gives the audience the opportunity to get clarification. So if there's anything that was confusing or that they didn't quite understand, it gives them to kind of get them up to speed and make sure that everybody gets the message that you want to give them.
Yep. So you get a little bit of a clarification. I think you also get a little bit of, you start to understand what their concerns are, right? You may be speaking about something, but they may be concerned about something that maybe you're not covering. And this is really, really important. A lot of people don't do this. Most people, and you can raise your hand if you've done this before, most people, and I always joke that it's usually the senior executive's fault, are putting slides in at the last minute. That makes absolutely no sense. None whatsoever. So you need to practice Q&A so that you nail it when it shows up. Again, Q&A, doesn't matter how sexy your presentation is, everybody. If you can't answer questions effectively, you are not going to win the job. You're going to lose some credibility because Q&A is not credibility neutral. So you've got to not only write out the questions you think your audience will ask, but you got to write out and say the answers out loud. Probably one of the best ways to prepare for Q&A is think of questions that you think the audience might ask, but more importantly, I would show your presentation to somebody who doesn't know anything about your topic, which is generally the case, and let them come up with questions. Because the only way to get questions that someone else would ask is to ask someone else. So you've got to prepare for Q&A and then practice answering the questions so that the first time it's out of your mouth isn't just an okay answer, it's a great answer. So Joey, I don't know what the chat box looks like, but
yeah, there's a couple of there's a couple of more questions I want to try and get to before we finish in about 8 minutes. Let's see. Here's one that I really liked. Wait, I lost it. Oh, here it is. This is kind of a general question, but I think it's a really good one. Chris Boyle sort of raised the issue of, well, how do we make sure we keep the attention of everybody. Chris, do you want to elaborate on that at all, or?
Yeah, so when you're dealing, obviously, with a Zoom meeting, you have people who are sitting in front of their computer. When you're actually in a room full of people and you're giving a training, if they have their computer open in front of them, you can literally see them, they're typing away. But here in a Zoom meeting, you don't know if, they're looking at their screen or if they have multiple screens set up, and how do you keep them engaged? Obviously, speaking with intensity, telling good stories, those are things that are going to gather somebody's attention. But, in this world where it's very ADD and you got multiple things that you're going on, how do you just keep the attention of a person for a 30-minute, 40-minute training session when you're trying to relay what you're looking to get across?
Yeah, so it's incredibly important. It's important, obviously, in a Zoom situation as well as in person, right? It's not just for Zoom. Just in general, you have to keep people. I will tell you, Chris, people don't like my answer to this question, but I'm going to give you my answer anyway. My answer to this question, and I'm not aiming this at you in particular, Chris, but I think the key is to suck less. I think that I think that people vote with their attention spans. If they're doing when I was, people used to. My favorite example of this is when I was practicing. I read an article in the New York Times about a year or so ago about law professors complaining that it's much harder now to keep the attention of their law students because everybody has a cell phone, or they're able to look at their iPads and play games and surf the net during the lectures. And it really made me angry because I was in law school and I didn't pay attention. I just did the crossword puzzle. I mean, there's always been ways not to pay attention. It's not just, and I think it's because a lot of these law professors, they just aren't that good. They're not that interesting. So it's just what you just said, Chris. It's doing all the things that we're talking about. I do think one thing that really helps, that I think people should consider more of, especially for these longer programs, is two things. Number one, you need to make sure you're talking about stuff that your listeners are truly interested in. That means prior to the program, really polling the people that you're going to be speaking to, or at least some of them, and making sure that whatever you're talking about is truly on point. And then the second thing is to make it as interactive as you can. Sort of like what we're doing now, leaving lots of time for questions, making sure that it's actually more of a conversation than it is a lecture. Because I just don't think people want to hear lectures anymore. I think that the old model of public speaking, people stand up and speak in one direction, is kind of starting to feel more and more outdated every day. So that's the idea. I think most of the reason people don't pay attention is because people are just not interested, and you're not. I think it's on the speaker to really pay it, to hold the attention, leaving lots of time for Q&A and making sure you're really addressing your listeners' issues. Let's see. We've got. I want to make sure we. Here's one. David asks about how do we avoid rushing our first nerves at the beginning of a presentation. This is a really good question. They're all good questions, but I really like this question. Recommended. This is just about nerves in general, but also at the very beginning. Our general feedback about nerves is that, first of all, you're going to feel anxiety, so it's a normal thing. But the most important thing you need to do to overcome your anxiety is you need to practice your presentation. And the reality is that most people don't really practice. What they do, what a lot of people call practice, in our judgment, is not practice. Good practice is you say what you're going to say out loud from beginning to end without stopping, like it's a play. You have to say the actual words out loud. Speaking is public speaking is a spoken art, and you have to say the words. And if you don't say the words, you're not going to ever really feel comfortable. So I think it's interesting that you point out this idea of first nerves. I like that. I actually never heard that term, never heard it phrased that way before. David calls it first nerves. And it's true. We are usually most nervous at the beginning. I think it's about really practicing that beginning and sort of saying it over and over and over again so that you're going to nail it. at the very beginning. And this really leads us to what we see as the most important thing, that, what we would call the number one most important thing you can do to be better as a communicator is you got to practice. You got to rehearse your presentations out loud. And most people don't really do that. And so that's what we urge. I mean, just before we started this webinar, JD and I got on a call it was about an hour ago, actually. And we practiced what we were going to say. We didn't practice the whole thing, but we practiced the beginning, and we practiced. We this is what we do. The people that are good at this practice a lot. Let's see. Here's something that we. Let's see. Trevor says. Trevor, ask your question. Trevor's asking a little bit of a controversial. He's sort of trying to stir up a little controversy here. So I'm excited about this question. Go ahead, Trevor.
My question is, you were just talking about the lectures being kind of a old school thing going away. I'm just kind of wondering what's going to happen to TED Talks. Are people going to tune them out?
I don't think they're going to tune them out. I think TED Talks, there's always going to be a place for that. And I'll let JD jump in if he has a point of view on this as well. But I think there's a place for that. I will say this, the TED Talks that you see and that go viral are one of thousands and thousands. I mean, if there's 100 TED Talks, one of them goes viral, which if you've ever been to one of these TED Talk events, and I encourage you to do it, you'll see that, some of them are good. Some of the talks, are good, and some of them aren't so good. So I think the TED Talks are good. I'm not saying that a really entertaining speech is not something good. I will point out, though, that those TED Talks the good ones are not that long. So I think that's something to keep in mind. They're relatively short. I find those almost more like entertainment than business presentations. And business presentations, we're sort of more back and forth. JD, do you want to jump in on that?
The same thing. I've sat through an hour entertaining presentation. It was laced with stories and it was very engaging. But if you tried to do that with a finance director in a company, I probably would have fallen asleep.
Yeah, so it's about context. It's about context. There's some great TED Talk presentations. I really enjoy them. And I definitely enjoy them. Okay, let's see. Here's a question that just came in. Karen says, do you demand that participants are required to turn on their camera? Okay. Or do you ask them to turn the camera? Do we demand it? I mean, obviously we don't demand it. But I do think that in these meetings, I think it's a good idea to ask people to turn on their cameras. JD, what do you think? Can you hear me, JD?
I mean, that's what Joey said. Yes. Lost me.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think the basic idea here is that you want to have them turn on the camera. I think it leads to better engagement. The more you can see people, you have the better sense of connection with them. So I think I think those are the key things. So it's 12:31 by my clock. So let me wrap it up. Once again, this is our final webinar of the year. So we ended by focusing on the fundamentals. What are the fundamentals of great communication? And JD and I counted down the top 5, what we think of the top 5. Number 1, you have to keep it simple. Number 2, speak with intensity and make good, strong eye contact. Number 3, tell stories. Number 4, practice your Q&A. And then last one, but certainly not least, if you want to be really good at this, you've got to rehearse. And that means rehearsing out loud. So I want to thank you all for joining us for all these webinars this year. We've really enjoyed it. We are going to continue doing them next year. And so thank you all very much. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks,
Take
Joey.
care. Have a great holiday.